Okay, we'll get started. Everyone got at least some pizza, I hope. Feel free to sneak over and get some during the presentation or get more if you need some. Today we'll chat about Angular plus Firebase. Everybody know what Firebase is, at least vaguely familiar with it? Well, it's basically a NoSQL database. We'll get to that. So obviously it's a little bit of Angular, a little bit of Firebase, and Angular Fire is a suite of services. Really, it's just three that kind of tie Angular to Firebase and let you develop really, really quickly. It's probably the fastest I've ever gotten to writing code, meaningful code, as opposed to wiring the database up to the front end. And there are, of course, some shortcomings that we'll hit on later, too. To set these things up, it would help if you knew a little bit about NPM and Bower, perhaps even Gulp or Task Run or Grunt, whichever you prefer, but not essential. In fact, you don't even need Angular Fire. You can talk directly to Firebase with its own API. It's just that Angular Fire is specifically suited for Angular, so it helps you write code a lot faster. So what is Firebase? Database, right? This is from their site. Firebase is a mobile platform that lets you quickly develop high-quality apps, grow your user base, and earn more money. Firebase is made up of complementary features that you can mix and match to fit your needs. Now, it is not a pyramid scheme. I don't know why they include that bit about earning more money in the actual site itself. But I'm going to tell you guys about it today, and each of you is going to go tell two friends, and each of them is going to tell two friends. Don't leave, please. I'm not. What is it really? I mean, it's an alternative to Mongo, right? I mean, it's analogous with Mongo, a little bit different though, and we'll touch a little bit on that now. Let me show you guys the console for Firebase. Okay, I'm in here now looking at our data. So if you're familiar with Mongo, everything is stored as what? Anybody? Documents, right? That's specifically what they're called, but what is the data format? JSON, right? This is almost like that. You will push things into the database using JSON. But if you look at the structure here, let me let you kind of that. Does anybody want to take a stab at what this data format more closely resembles? A tree, right? Hash map, where we've got a bunch of keys, and then underneath each key is value. So a little bit different approach than Mongo, and there's some justification for it, specifically when dealing with arrays. And hopefully if I forget to touch on that later, we'll come back to it. But just to point out the difference here, the obvious difference between Firebase and Mongo, you're looking at more of a tree with nodes on it than straight up JSON documents that you would have in Mongo. Okay, so what is Angular Fire? It is, as I said, it's basically three services that let you talk to a Firebase database very quickly. You can, once you've imported that library, you can stand up services really, really quickly. I should also point out that there's a framework agnostic library, and I kind of touched on that briefly, that lets you talk directly to Firebase. And if you want to start there, I had to start there because right when the first time I tried to pick up Angular Fire, I went through Joe Eames' tutorial on Pluralsight. Joe Eames is great. I'm not trash talking him or anything, but Angular Fire was converting from 2 to 3. So I was trying to follow his tutorial, which was based on 2, and it was a disaster. So I had to back all that code out and just talk to Firebase first, which really was a good lesson. I learned a lot more about Firebase that way. So always good if you're very curious to get down into your components, check out the Firebase API, or sorry, the Firebase docs, and do it yourself before you do Angular Fire if you're really curious. But if you just want to get a prototype up and running really fast, then Angular Fire is certainly the way to go. Okay, so here are the three services: Firebase auth, object, and array. Auth obviously handles the authentication stuff. An object is basically if you're querying the database for a single object, you'll use that. If you're going to query for a collection, you would want to use the array. So those are the three very obvious things it does for you. Now, there's certainly more. And what is that? Well, three-way data binding, which is super cool. So I got you guys all here in one place today to just, if you only take away one thing from this, it's next 30 seconds to 2 minutes where I'm gonna point this out. And I'll show you the sample app here is just my my resume. So if we take a look at that, it's got a Firebase backend. You'll see here my position here at one of the hats I wear is our JavaScript practice lead. So let's keep an eye on that. And then also take a look at the actual data itself. Okay, well, we'll see JavaScript practice lead. Okay, everybody see that? Is the print large enough for you guys to at least kind of sort of make it out if you're squinting? Okay, so let's change that to okay. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to commit that here when I hit the enter key, but keep an eye on the left on that position, okay? Three-way data binding. I've changed the data on the back end. The changes were immediately pushed out to every client that's pointed at that data on the front end, which is really handy, especially in the mobile world where you're dealing with lots of real-time data and lots of users. Super cool. Change it back. I assume that's what's going on in the back end. I've never really picked down deeply or bothered to try to load it up in an older browser to see if it totally blew up IE6 or something like that. But I would imagine it's got to be WebSockets. I can't think of anything else that would do this so easily. So back to our presentation. Okay, so to get it, you can install it. It's if you go via Bower npm, it is Angular Fire. So just a quick install with one of those, and then you're up and running. Or at least you've got it. Then you initialize your app by putting in the dependency, and you see it's, although it's Angular Fire in the npm or Bower install, the dependency is actually Firebase. Okay, so now you've got it. What do you do with it? Okay, the most common usage cases here are, the initialization, which you pass a little bit of config information to it, and that way you can speak to the database later. It's basically a GUID for your Firebase account. Okay, authentication. It's got a pretty decent suite of authentication stuff. I primarily use sign in with email and password, and then you've got your CRUD stuff. So your all your simple database operations. Right. So here's the initialization. You'll see this when you first set up your database in Firebase, or your Firebase is the proper term. Yeah, there you go. Your API key, the domain URL, storage bucket, and messaging sender ID, which I believe is related to sending out push notifications to your users. That's most recently been added, very recently been added for web applications, primarily before it existed just for mobile apps. Okay. And I'll show you here a code example. Okay, so I've wrapped the Firebase stuff in my own services to give it a degree of encapsulation. That way, if you decide to change your backends, it's a little bit less work. So you see here, although I've given pretty straightforward examples, in these code examples here. They're not going to look exactly like this in the code that we're going through because I've wrapped it up a little bit. So if you guys have any questions about anything along the way, please don't.
Oh. Where does that run?
Sorry?
Where does it run?
Where does what run? This service?
Yeah.
Oh no, this is all client code. This is This is an Angular service for authentication. So you see in this service, I've wrapped up some of the Firebase stuff. So here, particularly in the initialize app method, sure. Holler when I'm in close enough. Look good? All right. Okay, so we set the database reference after we pass along that config information, which is up here. Then we set our database reference, which basically is a URL. I mean, there's more to it than that, but you're basically passing the address to the node that you want to retrieve data from, or push data to, or update data at. That make sense? Okay. So here we're using that authentication service, and we're listening for a change. And that's not especially important right now. Shortly after, if a user wishes to log in, we'll pass in the email and password, and then call in the Firebase authentication method. Okay? It does return a promise. So if it errors out, I just display a message to the user saying, hey, got invalid credentials, or this account doesn't exist, etc. Creation, retrieval, update, and delete. Oh, sorry, database initialization. Getting ahead of myself. Zoom back out here. We should point out here that when you add the Angular Fire library to your project, you're going to get Firebase in the global space. It's kind of peculiar, and normally Angular does a really good job of wrapping stuff like that, so you don't have a lot of things polluting the global namespace, but you are going to have that Firebase variable out there, which is part of the reason why I encapsulated things on my own. So I would avoid temptation to grab that Firebase variable at inappropriately or where I shouldn't. Okay, we looked at authentication. Let me zoom in on that code. Okay, so adding a record is usually calling up a reference and then calling the push method on that reference. And then the parameter for that is the thing that you're trying to push down. That code makes sense to anybody? Any questions about that? Okay, pretty similar with delete. I'm sorry, retrieve. Okay, when you push a new record into the database, or a new object into the tree, Firebase automatically generates and assigns that ID. That's the that value that we saw here, these IDs, right? Those are user assigned. Now, I have read in the documentation that these roughly correspond to dates. So that if you want to sort on date order, by default, your data is going to be sorted in order that it was entered. Sorry, guys. Okay, now that you've got your object, if you've retrieved it from the database, the object, the Firebase object, and the Firebase array both have a save method, $save. As you know, Angular junk is usually prefaced by $, or 2, or occasionally even 3, I think. So here we have $save on the object, and the Firebase array has $save element that takes the member of the array that you're trying to save. So I find that to be a little bit clunky, and I'll show you why. So here I've wrapped all those all those base Firebase methods in my own. And this is the list of all the things you would generally want to do with your data. And you see here, if I'm trying to update an array element, I need to know that array and the element itself. And that's because, let me go back here. The Firebase array is not, and this is a mistake I made at first, it is not an array of Firebase objects. They're just plain old JavaScript. I'm sorry, they're plain old JavaScript objects in there. Now, and this gets back to the point. One of the reasons that they use a hash map instead of just a straight up document. Does anybody want to take a stab at why they would do that? No? Concurrency problems, exactly. Specifically with arrays, because this is, I actually stumped the Mongo presenter a couple months back at the UJUG. I asked him how they handle concurrency in arrays, and he really didn't know. His best answer was that they just lock the whole document down. So if you've got an array on there, if I'm a user behind you trying to change that, I won't be able to until you're done with it. And I imagine that's not going to scale as well as the solution in Firebase. Because if let's say we're both pointed at an array, and I'm trying to update element 2 and you've already removed it, well, what happens, right? Somebody's going to clobber somebody else's change. Well, using these particular IDs and hash maps, you're always going exactly to the data that you want to update, even an element in an array, because each element in the array has its own key.
How does that save you from your concurrency problem? Because basically you're just both messing around with a different object at that point, right?
A different element in the array with its own ID.
Well, if you're both messing around with the same chunk of data, right? So he wants to update it, and I wanted to add something to it. Who wins?
First in, first out, I'd imagine, but
does it make, instead of dealing with the whole array and clobbering everything in the array,
you're dealing with one singular, right?
So you just have less likelihood.
So even if you
So
pull,
you're just reducing the amount of collision that you're going to have, not necessarily solving the problem.
you're narrowing the window for collision, right? By a good degree, because we both have to be pointed at the very same element in the array at the same time to have conflicting change. Make sense? So what Mongo generally does is you're just stuffing the whole array down there, minus any changes or plus any additions that you've made to it, as opposed to just operating on one element in the array at a time. Okay, retrieval is as easy as passing the URL to the node that you want to retrieve data from. And if that's a singular object, of course, you'll cast it as a Firebase object. If it's an array, you'll cast it as an array. And finally, deletions, handled by the $remove. And again, both the object and the array support the $remove method. Now, I did myself, shot myself in the foot once because, well, you probably haven't, we talked a little bit earlier about Angular 2 earlier and the pseudo strong typing that you get out of it. Well, I made the mistake once of thought I was calling $remove on an array. I had actually passed in an object, so I deleted the whole object. So always test before you delete. Make sure you know what you're looking at. So, fortunately, it wasn't production. Okay, so let's see it in action. It's okay. I've kind of already given most of this away, but Okay, so here we've got on the left a complete list of the skills, things that I've monkeyed around with, right? And on the right, this is kind of the maintenance screen where I can add a new skill if I want. And these are two different sessions. On the right hand, I'm hitting the live data. On the left hand, well, they're both pointing at the same data, sorry. On the right hand, I'm pointed at the deployed version of the application. And on the left, I'm looking at the development version of the application. But they're both pointed at the same data, so we get those three-way data binding benefits, right? So see that immediately appears on the left there. And if I were to remove it, immediately be gone. Right? Thanks to that three-way data binding, which it's kind of they had me at this feature. It could have been garbage after that, and I probably still would have gone after it. So that's the long and the short of it. I can walk you guys through some more examples if we like. In fact, I hope that we have some time for some Q&A after. Some of the additional features, once you set up your Firebase account, it's got free basic services. So all the stuff I've done in it so far, you haven't paid a dime for. Once you start scaling, fees start to apply. Like I think they start at about $25 a month. It's got a pretty reasonable amount of storage, and they even hosts, as you can see there on the left, my app is actually deployed to Firebase. I'm not really paying anything for them to host it. It also comes with a suite of command line tools for you to deploy your app. So really easy to work with, but may not be for you. So there are a couple problems with it. Since it's pretty much just your client and the database, it really results in writing a lot of extra client-side logic. So you're doing a lot of things in your Angular services that probably ordinarily you would relegate to the back end. And that would include exposing some of your business logic, right? So things that are usually best kept hidden, you're going to have out there in the open. The biggest problem I had with it, though, was the fact that on the server side, the authorization and validation code, this is an example of database rules. It's a JSON file, sort of, kind of, that lives on their server, is associated with your database, and it has all the rules for data validation and user authorization. They all have to live in one single file. As you can see here, even in a really simple example, it's kind of a mess, right? And it's not human readable, and it really takes, since it's not exactly JSON, it's really a lot to get used to. So I could spend probably an hour talking about how to make that thing work, and it would probably just make you all sick. So the final takeaway from it is that if you're looking to poke around, stand up a database really quick, and you need persistent data, it's fantastic. If you're doing something pretty simple or prototype, something you want to show off to a client real fast, it's phenomenal. But if you want to go into a little bit more detail, it's really not a best choice unless you probably have a middle tier that's talking to Firebase for you, in which case you would lose the benefits of Angular Fire because it's suited to talk right to the database. So that is that. Any questions?
So talking about this whole concurrency issue, what kind of transactional support do you have Firebase and that you've got it using? If any.
Well, basically what you would set up in that database rules JSON, right? Or the database rules file, and that and nothing more that I can see. If there's one improvement I would like to see in the next version or an incremental version, it's probably full-on code, real JavaScript or whatever language they want to use, even if it was its own language or something that's proprietary and belongs to them only. Because jamming all that stuff into one file is just a pain. I mean, one missing bracket, you could do some awful damage.
And then they don't have any editor help or anything like that. You're just whatever you drop in there.
Yeah, whatever you push in there. Now you can when you try to push it, if it's not valid, it does get parsed on their side. And they'll throw an exception if you try to jam junk in there. But it's kind of what you see is what you saw in that example is what you get. It's pretty awful. I forgot to point out one of the other things I did not like about Firebase is that querying is awful. I mean, even something as simple as an OR, like give me people whose names equal this or like that, or they're virtually impossible. Now, I have read that some blog posts about folks that have standing Elasticsearch on top of it, which looks like a pretty good option. I've not played around with it at all yet. Now, of course, once you pull up your data, you can do any number of things to filter it and display it to the user, but it's kind of expensive, and you're getting a bunch of data that you might not need, right? By pulling up an entire data set, but I only wanted about 1/3 of it, it's kind of a waste. Denormalization is another, coming from my background is kind of a database geek. The denormalization that they suggest in Firebase, and really any NoSQL database, it's a lot to swallow. And their argument is that disk space is cheap, so you can afford the denormalization, but time is not, and you want to get that data to your users as quickly as possible. So in an example I was looking at of a chat room application, you're basically sending copies of all the chats to all the users. They're not pointed at one single set of records. They each maintain their own separate copy. So if something were to change about that, you've got to write your updates to go out and make sure you hit all the appropriate copies of your records, which obviously is problematic. Right? Well, that is it. Anything you guys want to see, talk about?
The data types do you have the underlying data stored? String, JSON string.
Yeah, it could be anything. Fields can be multi-valued. Now, in your validation, in your validation version, that giant ugly file that we looked at.
At the end of the day, it's just JSON.
Right. Yes, JSON-ish. Yeah.
I'm saying, does that mean that Angular 1, like you looked at like Angular 2 or React support Firebase, or?
Well, they do have their own. Firebase has its own library, so its own library of tools that you can go out and talk directly to a Firebase.
Angular Firebase, is that specifically for one?
Angular Fire is geared just strictly for Angular, and I imagine it's doing all the Firebase stuff that their other plain old vanilla Firebase library does. It even imports that as a dependency, I think, a sub-dependency. So that is what's going on. Ultimately, you're using plain old JavaScript to talk to Firebase. Through that Firebase global variable, I kind of warned everybody about not to try to wrap it up so you don't squish it. So you could immediately work with any front end you wanted, any kind of front end framework. It would sit right in React and do quite well.
So like in the code, we were retrieving an object called Firebase, and then it was wrapped in a $sign Firebase object, $sign Firebase. So what is the raw Firebase driver giving you, then Firebase object $sign wraps?
Probably the most complicated case is the case of an array. Remember on the server side, we're storing what is essentially a tree, right? But what Firebase does, while you wrap it in that Firebase array service, is so that it takes those and then converts them into a JavaScript-friendly array that acts and behaves exactly as you would expect. And then when you push it back down, it does that translation again, so that you don't have to worry about those issues with concurrency.
So you could work with the objects directly to make it easy to find it anywhere.
Yep, and that's where you get the three-way database, three-way data binding lives too. So I imagine event listeners are being set up and killed as appropriate by those services. Okay, well.
What made you want to start looking at Firebase? Were you just tinkering around, want to check it out, or did you get access from a client, or?
Well, forever I've had that online resume standing up forever. It was originally pointing at Mongo data, but I was always frustrated that they didn't really handle authentication well. And once I learned a little bit about Firebase, I thought it would be a lot easier to authenticate through any means. There's also third-party authentication. You can log in with your Google account, Facebook account, and several others that escape me. And I can get in and edit the data really easily. And Angular loves it. It's several lines of code, whereas I had to write a couple of services with Mongo to do it. So. Wake up. Okay, have some more pizza. Thank you guys for coming. Appreciate it.